So, if you'll recall, last week I ended urbanization with talking about immigrants and unions and incorporation. So, the point of my discussion of huge changes in corporations is that industrial growth depended not on economic factors alone, but on changes in what people were willing to accept and how work was defined, and consequent changes in the law that governed workers in the workplace. So today we're going to talk about the crisis of capitalism in the 1890s and what all these factors came together to bring. So in 1900, just 3% of workers were unionized, and these were not immigrants or unskilled workers. So what you may be thinking is, why don't workers form unions and exercise their power as the indispensable element in an industrial economy? Well, we talked about this last week. Workers have one weapon, and it's strikes. But strikes fail even when they win because of state power. Employers can easily replace workers with new immigrants, especially unskilled workers. They have no bargaining power. Remember, we talked about de-skilling. Workers are divided by skill and by prejudice. And skilled workers feel little in common with unskilled workers. There's seemingly no common ground between highly skilled cabinet makers and unskilled manual laborers. But workers did strike, and let's talk about a couple of those. You may have heard of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Workers go on strike and also attack the trains that are being run by scabs, and if you don't know what a scab is, when workers go on strike and employers bring in other people to do that work, the people they bring in are sometimes referred to as scabs. The greatest violence during this strike breaks out in Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh militia refuses to fire on people they know, and the Philadelphia militia is called out. They kill some workers but are forced to flee. Pittsburgh is left to the mob. There's looting, burning, and it frightens the people who live there. The working poor are defined as alien and uncivilized, and we see this in The Nation magazine after the strike. Because of their blood as immigrants and different ethnicities, they are inherently un-American, unassimilable, and a threat to American society. So, right, we talked about assimilation last week as well. Middle-class Americans are too scared by the violence of strikes to embrace workers' issues and are, for the most part, alienated. There was the Carnegie Steel Strike, 1892 to 1893, Fort Frick. Armed Pinkerton detectives meet armed workers, and the results are bloodshed and death. So economic and social divisions in the late 19th century appeared to be tearing American society apart. Middle-class Americans are very afraid of the threat of class warfare. This is evident in some of Rees's work and many other novels written at the time about class warfare and its alternatives. Fear of anarchy and increasing use of state and federal power against strikers and on the side of big businesses. So the environment is just full of fear of the unknown. So meanwhile, there's trouble in the countryside too. And this leads to the populist movement. It starts out with the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance comes up in the 1880s. They are a response to both political tensions and racial tensions. They gather together as an organization to be the voice of Western farmers' grievances. So under their platform of populism, they want the debt in gold for industrial agriculture to be lessened, and they want cooperative solutions. So they desire government aid to farmers, and we could see that in the case of Munn versus Illinois in 1877. Illinois can inspect grain elevators, and business interests used for the public good can be regulated by the government. So the government can now regulate the railroads after Munn versus Illinois in 1877, and this is a big deal. There was also a Farmers Alliance chapter in North Carolina. And their 1892 populist program, they wanted more money in circulation. They wanted state and federally subsidized warehouses. They wanted public ownership of all transportation and communication, telegraph, telephone, railroads. They wanted an income tax rather than other taxes, and they wanted the direct election of senators. So these are all, you can see some of the motivations in some of these desires, right? Subsidize warehouses so that different places can't charge different amounts for storing things like grain. Public ownership of transportation and communication to move their goods. They don't want to have to pay more or have prices driven up and gouged because there's no regulation there. So populism is a response to corporate dominance of the countryside. They propose reforms that they think will protect small farmers from national corporate powers, and the government is one part of that. So there are rural and urban challenges and great political turmoil overall. So the great central question during this time is, what did freedom mean in this newly industrial society? 19th century Americans were extremely concerned about immigration and the changes in American society. Much more was at stake than simply poverty or disease. The question was, will American values persist in the face of these social and economic changes? And of course, we can also ask the question, what were American values? Is industrial capitalism, with its immigrants and its labor strife and its inequality, compatible with free democratic society? Or is industrial capitalism, with its richly rewarded entrepreneurs and its freedom of choice, the essence of a free democratic society? So much like we saw with the labor debate, two dominant positions emerge to answer these questions about society. Both drew on the same heritage of American democratic ideals and symbols of freedom. Both put work, wage labor, and at the center of American debates over the meaning of freedom. So the first group was reformers. Reformers see industrialism as a threat to freedom. These people are socialists, they are religious people, and they are overall societal and political reformers. These are the different types of people that make up this group. So middle-class readers flocked to books about reform, like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward and Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. They argue that the new economic system was simply not compatible with American democracy and freedom. The other group was made up of social Darwinists. Social Darwinists see the markets as guaranteeing freedom. So men like Andrew Carnegie and William Graham Sumner argue that the new economic system was the essence of American democracy and freedom. And as quoted previously, Carnegie wrote in The Gospel of Wealth in 1889, quote, "We accept and welcome great inequality of environment, the concentration of business, industrial and commercial, in the hands of a few, and the law of competition between these as being not only beneficial, but essential to the future of the race." One major figure in the social Darwinist group was William Graham Sumner. He was a professor of sociology at Yale University. So Sumner was very critical of the attempts of reformers like Bellamy and Riis to remake society and answer these questions about industrialization in the ways that they were attempting to do. So Sumner, in his opinion, this reform was not a way of fixing society. It was rather a justification of the way things were. So Sumner takes a much harsher view toward poverty and the poor in society overall. He uses Darwinian metaphors such as survival of the fittest. So social Darwinists like Sumner take the Darwinian view of evolution and apply it to society. He uses Darwinian biology as a metaphor. So this so-called social Darwinism actually has very little to do with the actual Darwinian biology. Darwinian biology is based on a retrospective evaluation of the persistence of genetic material. It is historical, it looks backwards, it does not predict, and it is never useful for making policy. So mischaracterizing that science, Sumner believes that survival of the fittest will carry society forward. Social Darwinists like Sumner justify industrial society by making it a part of evolution. Sumner and other social Darwinists ignore that all people were not born equal. So people are born with wealth, for example, and those people have a huge advantage. This contradicts the notion of evolution, which is supposed to help those with some genetic advantage rather than outside assistance, such as like the Rockefeller family and generations of hoarded wealth. This view looks at capital, also known as, having money and wealth, as a moral advantage as a result of self-denial. So Sumner argues that capital might appear to bestow an unfair advantage, but it really represents a reward given to the more moral aspects of society. So social Darwinists equate wealth with moral superiority. And according to Sumner and social Darwinists, the poor cannot be helped. The poor have no one to blame but themselves. He argues that if people are poor, it is because they are unfit and morally inferior. Helping the poor actually hurts society, according to social Darwinists. If people interfered to bring the poor up to an equal level, they would cause stagnation and the downfall of society. Social Darwinists supported the economic policy of laissez-faire, which is also known as the leave-it-alone market policy, and leaving free competition and unregulated markets to go about their ebbs and flows as they would naturally on their own without outside interference. So this policy of laissez-faire is now turned into an explanation for why the rich and powerful dominate society. Free competition becomes the goal rather than the means to an egalitarian society as it had been seen in the early republic. And pop culture begins to reflect these views. Horatio Alger, for example, he was less sophisticated than Sumner, but his ideas were less harsh and more widely looked to than Sumner. Alger wrote children's books about poor, honest street urchins who rose up to become successes. And this resembles a previous generation's version in Poor Richard's Almanac by Benjamin Franklin. So Horatio Alger wrote the book Ragged Dick, which is Ben Franklin's Poor Richard. So it's an old story and updated for new times. So let me tell you a little bit about this story and how it reflects what we've just been talking about. Ragged Dick is a homeless kid who works as a shoe shine boy in New York. He meets a rich kid named Frank and his uncle, who tell him that his future position depends mainly on himself. So Dick takes this advice to heart, reforms his life, educates himself, stops spending his money on cigars and vaudeville, starts saving, and gets a room. So one day, he is riding a ferry and a girl falls off. He jumps in and saves her, and it turns out that she's a rich girl. Her father is so grateful that he gives Dick a job. Dick works his way up to become successful and wealthy. And that's where his story ends happily. So Dick becomes a success through working hard, being thrifty and moral, and taking advantage of his big break when it comes. So the moral of the story is that he does it all on his own. But does he really do it all on his own? What would have happened if that girl hadn't fallen off the ferry and her father hadn't given him a job? So there was definitely hard work on his part, but it's not all on his own. So how does this compare with what Jacob Riis and Henry George say about success? Well, abandoned kids are starved to death for money. Newsboys might be ragged dicks, but they can only get help ahead with help, like Dick got with that girl's father, right? But according to social Darwinists, the key to success is morality and proper values. So the central question during this time is, whose fault is it that the poor remain poor? And these two groups, reformers and social Darwinists, answer this question quite differently. Bellamy and Riis take a social economic structure and approach to answering the question. Alger and Sumner look at the individual. But buried in this are assumptions about ethnicity, religion, and race. Throughout Alger's books, all of the heroes are poor, white, and Protestant, and the villains are generally poor but Catholic. So reform takes a look at society and tries to figure out how society itself can change for the better, whether it's Riis's look at tenement housing and improving housing structures, or Other reformers looks at temperance and things like that to do an overall approval for society. Alger and Sumner look at individuals as social Darwinists. If you're poor, you must be morally unfit and you've done it to yourself somehow. So really these two positions come down to this. Is society made up of individuals or classes? Are you best represented on your own or as a member of a larger group of people like you? There's an old American insistence on individual opportunity thrown into question by the reality of industrial work. So work is at the heart of this difference. We talked about the civic ideal and the contract ideal, right? Under the civic ideal, you look at citizenship, and it's very Republican and individual. It's anti-wage labor. Freedom is largely political and involves the ability to participate politically. Contract ideals involve the market in terms of freedom. It's pro-wage labor. They draw their point of comparison largely from slavery. If you're not a slave, then you're free, and you're free to sell your own labor and buy the labors of others. So both focus on class differences. The middle class moves back and forth between these two positions. And part of that is that they have a fear of the working class and it motivates them, especially as we've seen in strikes and things like that. The middle class reacts negatively to the violence that often comes as a result of some of these strikes. So the divide between social Darwinists like Sumner and social reformers like Rees has political consequences. And the biggest question at the central heart of how these people approach this issue is, what is the purpose of government? Should it intervene in the economy to regulate industrial economies and corporations, or should it keep out of economic and social arenas? These questions are quite urgent because the 1890s witnesses an economic crisis unequaled in American history. Concerns about the industrial economy have domestic consequences and foreign policy consequences. So first I want to talk about the economic crisis of the 1890s, and then we're going to get into a little bit about how people respond to it, which is going to lead us into next week. The 1890s saw the most severe economic depression in the nation's history. The crisis perfectly illustrates the paradox of the industrial economy. At this point, the U.S. is too good at production. So overproduction and overcapacity drove prices down in agriculture and industry, and it ruined businesses. After 1893, unemployment soared to 20%, and it was much higher among industrial workers. 4 million people were unemployed by mid-1894, and the Depression lasted until 1901. Meanwhile, extremely low wages meant most Americans were not consumers. So low wages plus low prices equals no growth and depression. Economic policies of the day made things worse. The tariff blocked overseas markets and raised prices at home. The gold standard created expensive credit, and a lack of regulation created catastrophic competition among businesses and corporations. So the bottom line was that Americans could not afford to buy what they produced. The government seemed unable to do anything about this so-called crisis of the 1890s, and it lasted for 8 years. The economic theory of the day was laissez-faire, and that government should only intervene to aid economic growth, but could do nothing to curb depression. So with a government unable or unwilling to do anything about the suffering, Americans articulated their own responses. Two responses were both based on where people were during the period of industrial growth in the 1890s, urban and rural. Industrial workers responded to the crisis with unions and strikes. Farmers, as we have seen, responded with the populist movement and the new Populist Party. However, there was a third response lurking on the horizon, not too far away. It was a foreign policy response, and it was an expansion overseas. And we will take a look at the United States' early expansion overseas and the politics of imperialism next week.